Hey all, Alex here at your home of the Music Deep Dive, and today it is time for the first part in a multi-part series that we are going to start doing on this channel, and that is going to be reviewing some of the most popular and highly acclaimed biographies of the man, the myth, the legend, Abraham Lincoln, the 16th President of the United States. And today we're going to start with a review of the 1954 book by Carl Sandburg, Abraham Lincoln, The Prairie Years and the War Years. This is specifically a review of this one-volume edition that I'm holding right here. The series was initially published as a 6-part series. Volumes 1 and 2 were called Abraham Lincoln, The Prairie Years, and volumes 3 through 6 were Abraham Lincoln, The War Years. Now, I'm not going to really say anything about Abraham Lincoln. I would imagine most people know who the man is. But I'm going to talk a little bit about the project specifically. Of course, I've been doing reviews of presidential biographies since I've started this channel, going all the way back to James Monroe, the biography by Tim McGrath, I believe was my first presidential biography that I reviewed. And, you know, I have always been I always knew that I was going to do multiple biographies of Lincoln because of his significance to American history. And there's benefits in doing that. The main benefit is that as I kind of undertake my own projects and my own kind of narrative that I'm researching for continually and, you know, building a narrative for in that case, part of the learning process there is understanding how one story, one person's story or one just story in history is told differently by multiple people, especially over a large period of time. And there's not really a better example for that than the man who maybe has had more biographies written about him than anybody else in recorded history. Abraham Lincoln is just a fascinating figure in so many different ways. And public perception of Lincoln, I think, has changed over the years in very tangible ways, but has always remained largely very positive. And I think that dynamic is interesting. Such a complicated individual who objectively played such a huge part in American history. And yet, even though there's still the disputes about the specifics of his personality and the nature of his personality, no one can doubt either the impact he had or the overall positive influence that the direction he led the country in overall, as far as abolishing slavery and everything else that went with that. So figuring out where to start with this was kind of an interesting challenge. Ultimately, the decision that I made was I went back as far as I felt I reasonably could go. Once you get further past the Sandburg biography, you start getting to books that are pretty inaccessible, at least just from you could probably find them on things like the Internet Archive and stuff like that. But I'm not out here trying to read 100 biographies. I selected about 10 or so, a lot of them from more recent, because those are generally going to have the most up-to-date research. But we're going to start with the Carl Sandburg one. Now, Carl Sandburg, if you're not aware, was an American poet based out of Chicago, wrote quite a bit of poetry and literary works that are themed around the city of Chicago specifically. He also wrote a collection of American folk songs called the American Song Bag, which you can kind of maybe see. It's on my bookshelf over here that I've not gotten to yet. But I knew Sandburg's influence. The man has won, many, many, many awards, 3 Pulitzer Prizes specifically, including one for the 4-volume history of the war years. It's interesting because Sandburg, so the Prairie Years initially came out in 1926, and it was a 2-volume biography, and Sandburg's whole idea of writing about Lincoln was because he wanted to focus on the early years. And then when that 2-volume series became super successful, Sandburg kind of switched gears and started writing a history about the war years as well. And so as a result, you have this massive 6-volume history that to this day is still regarded as probably the most influential biography of Abraham Lincoln that's ever been written. And it's, when I describe all this, when I describe the construct of this biography, it's possible that some people will recall another series of books that I recently reviewed by Shelby Foote about the history of the Civil War. And that's exactly where my mind went as well. Especially once you get into some of certainly the praise of the Sandburg books, but also some of the critiques. Here is someone whose background is in fiction and whose background is in, literary works, but isn't necessarily an historian. And a lot of the criticism surrounding the Sandburg books are that his books are not super original. They're drawing off a ton of other people's research and not really adding anything to it. And that he's repeating a lot of stories that are very debatably true, some perhaps even demonstrably false. So right away, you get that sense of overlap. And I will not pretend as though when I was actually reading the Sandburg one-volume series, which the single volume is about 800 or so pages for reference, I'm not going to pretend like I didn't draw some of the same comparisons. Again, especially when you get into the idea that this was never intended to be a work of extreme historical rigor, more so someone kind of not pontificating, but maybe writing something that was meant to tell a compelling American story. And in doing that, sort of eschews historical rigor and the type of documentation that you would hope for from a work of history in favor of narrative. The idea that Sandburg wanted this to be more of an epic than an actual work of just straight up history. There is clearly a lot of overlap there. And if there is a major flaw of the Sandburg volume, I think it is definitely that. I will not pretend to disagree in any way. The other thing that I want to comment on is so this again is a single volume edition of the book. And clearly there is imbalance in how the book was initially released. It was a 2-volume set for the Prairie years, which encompasses most of the pre-war years essentially, and then the war years are the actual years where he was president. So there's imbalance in there already. And I think it's really felt in the single volume edition. It feels like there are very big chunks of Lincoln's life as a lawyer, as a representative, and as a kind of up-and-coming politician that are sped through. It's not that they're ignored, but they're sped through, and you don't really get to spend a lot of time with that aspect of Lincoln's life because we're rushing to the war years. And we're rushing to the war years because that's where Lincoln really makes a difference. And honestly, probably because that's where a lot of the existent writings that Sandburg is taking from focus on. I don't begrudge Sandburg for that necessarily, but I do think it reminds me of some of the other weaker presidential biographies that I've read, where the early years just do not get talked about almost in any way because we don't know that much about them and the author's not particularly interested in researching about them, so we just get a few pages about them and then it's on to the presidential years. So in that way, I think there are issues with this Sandburg volume that I am fine pointing out. But what I can tell you is this. Number one, I think I would be very curious how I feel about the kind of 6-volume set and whether or not these issues would just kind of exacerbate themselves more over time. And it makes me wonder, going back to the Shelby Foote review, whether or not if I had read just like a single volume condensed version of that, if Foote's writing quirks would have bothered me as much. I kind of feel like they wouldn't have. Because certainly I didn't feel like Sandburg and his approach to not citing sources explicitly. I do think his bibliography is better than Foote's. I'll give him that. But I don't think I would be as bothered by Sandburg's reliance on anecdotes and quotes. Where I should say, I think I would be bothered more by it if I had read the full 6-volume series. I do think, objectively, though, he does handle it a little bit better than Foote, because Foote tends to repeat a lot of his quotes just as kind of matters of fact. Like, these are stories, here's how they happened, and not really question them. And Sandburg, on multiple occasions, will make a quote saying, this is what supposedly happened, and that type of thing. So he's at least leaving that leeway for, hey, here's the anecdote, but I'm not necessarily giving it all the benefit of the doubt that it definitely happened that way. And I appreciate that. I think there's a little bit more of an historian's rigor to that approach than what Foote is doing. And so I like that. And the other piece of this is I think that Sandburg's writing is very billowy. I think billowing is kind of the first word that comes to mind. It's a really just shocking and beautiful style of prose that he utilizes. And it's really the type of elegant writing, these types of descriptions that are larger than life. I mean, don't get me wrong, we are still talking about Lincoln as a capital G great man. But that approach, like his writing style, also humanizes Lincoln in a way, still touting his greatness while also emphasizing the humane aspects of him, the awkwardness of his physical appearance, the sort of humor that he had, the sort of darker sides of his personality, the sides of his personality where, you know, people around him thought he seemed genuinely unstable at points, especially during the war. I think that Sandburg does a really good job of highlighting all that, and doing so with this really just, again, striking physical descriptions and these adjectives and phrases that he's using that seem to connect Lincoln to humanity, but also to some sort of like greater natural existence. It's I'm doing a horrible job of explaining it, but I would imagine, I would just say that I think there's a lot of like descriptions of Lincoln and his life and just the things that he's doing and descriptions of the settings of them. I think that's another big piece of it, is that Sandburg is putting all this stuff into context, describing the minutia of the log cabin that he grew up in, or the office that he sat in while he was a lawyer, or the minutia of, towards the end, the scene in Ford's Theater. I think that's a very striking kind of play-by-play, the way that Sandburg frames that whole scene. And it's just powerful. And I think that in that way, it shares the strength of the Shelby Foote volumes, but I don't know that Foote in that 3-part series ever gets to stretch his legs as effectively as Sandburg does here. I think Sandburg, Foote never really gets to sit with a single subject long enough to really stretch his legs. I think if he had tried to write a biography of any of those figures, he probably could have done justice in much the way that Sandburg does here. But Sandburg really gets to sit with Lincoln. He really gets to kind of paint these pictures at his own pace. And even though this is, again, an abridged edition, I think Sandburg does a fantastic job with what he's got and the time that he has and the space that he has on the page. And I think it's super effective. It's super well done. So all in all, what do we have here? I think it's a book that I'm not really entirely sure how to feel about. It's interesting when you read the introduction to this that Sandburg talks about how there's nothing new that could possibly be written about Lincoln under the sun. And I mean, this edition of the book came out in 1954. His initial works came out years before that. I mean, he's writing these books while there are, veterans of the Civil War still alive. And he's saying that there's nothing new that could be said about Lincoln under the sun. So, in that sense, when you see why people criticize this book, saying that there's not a whole lot of original research and that sort of thing, yada, 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 it makes sense, because I think Sandburg is almost like, I'm just going to tell you what you already know, but tell it in a more interesting and, hammed up, that sounds derogatory, I don't mean it in that sense, and in a more just kind of flamboyant and spectacular way than maybe you've heard it told before. I'm going to tell the literary kind of story of Lincoln's life and take that sort of fiction, novelist, poetic approach, because in a way Lincoln's life really does read as poetry in so many ways, and that's part of the fascination about it. So, as a work of history, I don't really recommend this. I am near certain, in fact, I'm factually certain, because I read some of these other Lincoln biographies that we're coming to later on. There will be other books that will scratch your historical itch better than the Sandburg volume will. But what I will say in this book's defense is, I think if you were looking for someone who is just kind of waxing poetic about one of the great, complex, and influential individuals in the history of the United States, if you're just looking for someone to tell that story in a very, in cursive, I suppose you could say, rather than just printed out text, this book I think is really well done in that way, and I think there is value to reading it in that sense. Also, I think I think the history in this book is portrayed fairly more even-keeled than you might expect, especially considering the era that it's in. Not too much that I think has aged especially poorly. I mean, like people like figures like Sojourner Truth and Frederick Douglass get mentioned several times. There's not too much in that area where I feel like Sandburg is lacking. I think he addresses the real issue of slavery in a lot of ways and its direct impact on Lincoln and some of the experiences that Lincoln had observing slavery and slave auctions and that sort of thing. So it's aged well in that sense. Maybe it hasn't aged well in others, but I think it is genuinely worth your time. I just don't necessarily think, especially given its age, especially given its lack of historical rigor compared to other Lincoln biographies, I don't think this is the first one I would recommend if you're looking to familiarize yourself with the man and with his story. But not a waste of time by any means. It's a solid read. With that, I want to thank you all so much for watching. Please make sure to like, comment, and subscribe. As always, more reviews are to come. Make sure to hit that bell for notifications and tell a friend as well. Thanks a lot, and I'll see you next time right here at your home of the Music Deep Dive.